What's up, guys? Welcome to the line change. And in this video, it's a bit of an interesting topic. Now, for those of you that have followed the channel and have seen the guests that I've had on this podcast, guys like Jeff Patterson, Rob Williams, Dave Hall, Brandon Astle, and David Quadrilli, every single one of them, I have asked a certain question, and that is, what would they change in Canucks history? Now, obviously, a lot of the answers that I got pertain to both 1994 as well as 2011 and the Stanley Cup run. And obviously, that is one thing that a lot of Canucks fans, that's the first thing that pops into their head, is if you could go back and change something in Canucks history, obviously, a lot of Canucks fans would go back and change Game 7 in 2011. The Canucks were one win away from winning the Stanley Cup. So if you had the power to go back in time and change something in Canucks history, that is most likely the obvious answer. Now, in this video, in this topic, it doesn't really revolve around that. We're going to do a little bit of a twist on this. We still are going to go back in Canucks history, but instead of changing just one thing in Canucks history, just one thing overall, we're going to go back in Canucks history and change a draft pick. Now, this is an interesting topic that I found, and I want to quickly, before we dive into it, give a big shout out and thank you to my sponsor, Gassy Jack Art, maker of that incredible artwork you see right there. You guys can check them out at GassyJackArt.com. So without any further ado, let's dive right into the topic. This article is brought to us by our friends at Canucks Army, in particular, a name that I just mentioned, David Quadrilli. Like most NHL teams, the Vancouver Canucks have had their fair share of misses at the draft. But which one is the greatest miss of all? That's the question we're going to try to answer today. If you want to dive further into this exercise, don't just give us a name and say this player drafted after them, had a better career, so this is my pick. This is about giving the Canucks the best chance to win it all with hindsight at our disposal. Would Matthew Tkachuk really have been enough for those Jim Benning-led Canucks teams to be a playoff contender, let alone win a Stanley Cup? It's doubtful, and that's ignoring the possibility that Tkachuk would have wanted out of Vancouver the same way he wanted out of Calgary. These aren't the kind of picks we're looking for, because this isn't a list of who are the biggest draft busts in Canucks history. You're correct that Olli Juolevi would find his name on that list. But that's not what we're doing today. That's also a big reason why Juolevi is not in the thumbnail, which, by the way, I had a lot of fun with. Rather, we want to go deep into the Canucks history books, and we want to hear your wild takes about what a different selection could have meant for the Canucks in the end. For example, what if the Canucks had selected Nelson BC-born Pat Price with the 10th overall pick in 1975 instead of Rick Blight? Price, who went just one pick later to the New York Islanders, had the best statistical year of his career in 1981-1982, while Blight was already out of the NHL at that point. Could Price have been the missing piece to help the Canucks capture their first Stanley Cup in 1982? Likely not, considering just how dominant that Islanders dynasty was, but hopefully now you get the exercise at hand. If you could go back in time and change any Canucks draft pick, who would it be and why? Let's examine some quality options. Starting off with Cody Hodgson, 10th overall in the 2008 NHL entry draft. Cody Hodgson's NHL career came to an unfortunate end after health issues forced him to retire at age 26. Hodgson struggled to find his footing as a young player, playing just 71 games with the Canucks before being dealt to the Buffalo Sabres in exchange for Zach Kassian. But what if the Canucks had used that draft pick and drafted Erik Karlsson, who was drafted 15th overall to Ottawa, or Tyler Myers, drafted 12th overall to Buffalo? Karlsson specifically was on the cusp of emerging as one of the game's elite defensemen during the 2010-2011 season. Could he have helped the 2011 Canucks get the job done? Even if your answer is no, adding a young defenseman of Karlsson's caliber almost certainly would have extended the Canucks' competitive window through the 2010s and the twilight of Henrik and Daniel Sedin's careers. Next up, we have Jake Virtanen, 6th overall in the 2014 NHL entry draft. Jake Virtanen was a common response when we recently asked Canuck fans who the biggest bust in Canucks history was, on top of having his conditioning called out at multiple training camps throughout his Canucks career, something that shouldn't really be a talking point for a pro athlete, let alone one as young as Virtanen was. Virtanen never put up the point totals to warrant getting any leash with his lack of defensive ability and overall hockey IQ. After signing a PTO with the Edmonton Oilers in 2021, Virtanen didn't make the team and hasn't played an NHL game since. Most recently, he finished 10th in team scoring on the Iserlohn Roosters of the DEL. William Nylander was taken just 2 picks after Virtanen at 8th overall, but the same logic we brought up earlier regarding Juolevi could apply here. Would William Nylander have been enough to get those mid-2010s Canucks teams over the hump? Maybe not, but an argument could be made given that Nylander has stuck around in a Canadian market his entire career and is one of the few Toronto Maple Leaf players who truly seems to give a you-know-what come playoff time. Next up, we have Jared McCann, 24th overall in the 2014 NHL entry draft. Now, the title of this article isn't if you could change any 2 Canuck draft picks, who would it be? But if it were, there's a case to be made for McCann as well. Even though McCann is a fine NHL player, and the Canucks used him as a surplus value asset to land them Erik Gunnarsson, player they thought very highly of. The Canucks had walked away from that 2014 NHL draft with both David Pastrnak, taken 1 pick after McCann, and Nylander. Well, then we're talking about that potentially being enough to win it all. Hindsight is 2020, though, and the Canucks weren't the only team to pass on Pastrnak. They were the last team to pass on him. However, that is at least worth mentioning. Next up, we have Patrick White, 25th overall in the 2007 NHL entry draft. Another popular pick when we asked fans for the biggest draft bust in Canucks history was Patrick White. White never played an NHL game and retired after a 6-year pro career spent entirely overseas in Europe. White is certainly an interesting name for this exercise, given that players taken in this draft class would have been reinforcements for the 2011 core and would have grown alongside the Sedins during the early to mid-2010s. Some of those names: Jamie Benn, 129th overall to Dallas; Wayne Simmons, 61st overall to Los Angeles; David Perron, 26th overall to St. Louis; and PK Subban, 43rd overall to Montreal. Final one, Michael Grabner, 14th overall in the 2006 NHL entry draft. Michael Grabner was a fine player and was somebody the Canucks traded for additional help for the 2011 team. But in this perfect scenario, if we could change any draft pick in Canucks history, we'd likely advise the Canucks to take Milan Lucic at 14th overall. Of course, this would have prevented the Boston Bruins from later selecting Lucic 50th overall in the second round, and that likely means the 2011 Bruins aren't nearly as good and nasty of a team as they ended up being. This is ultimately Quads' pick to rewrite the Canucks history books. The benefit of hindsight, which Canucks draft pick would you go back and change? So there's that article. So as with the end of the article, which by the way, I will leave a link to in the description down below. Actually, you know what? Before we end it, let's actually take a look at some of the comments, because it does have some comments here. So let me just show me the comments. Is it going to show me? No. Come on now. There we go. So you got some. One says the 1979 NHL draft, first round pick, the Canucks selected Rick Vave, and 3 picks later, Ray Bourque was drafted. So there's one right there. Canucks could have drafted Ray Bourque. The 47th overall pick, the Canucks selected Ken Ellicott. The 48th pick was Mark Messier. I'm not a big fan of that one for obvious reasons. The 68th pick, the Canucks selected Arthur Rutland. The 69th pick was Glenn Anderson. Any one of those picks would have helped the Canucks immensely during the 1982 Cup run, but imagine if they had drafted all 3. Very good point. Looking at some more. Let's see. First draft, instead of Dale Talon at second overall, I'd go Daryl Sittler, 6 picks later. One person said Jaromir Jagr instead of Peter Nedved. One person says Jared McCann was the right pick, or at least a good pick for that spot. The Canucks then squandered it by mismanaging his development. They would likely have done the same for any other player picked in his place. Virtanen was a flawed pick, but I think you can point the finger at ownership for that one. He was the most NHL ready out of the lot. That included Nylander and Ehlers, and ownership wanted to squeeze another cup run out of the core. It goes on to say McCann wasn't a bad pick, but he had a bad attitude, and those things aren't always obvious. I've always felt Boston got lucky with Pastrnak. Someone's mentioned Nedved versus Jagr. I'd have to agree with that one. Not that Nedved was a bust, but Jagr was close to being a generational talent. One person says, how about 2006? Instead of Grabner, reach for a little guy from the queue. Number 63, Brad Marchand, might change things in 2011. That is actually a very good one. We mentioned, Milan Lucic. Imagine if they had drafted Brad Marchand instead. Instead of Cam Neely at 9th overall in 1983, the Canucks draft Dominik Hasek, 199 overall. Then maybe we can't make a trade involving one of the best Canucks draft picks for a bag of pucks. We end up with arguably the best goalie in the history of the game. Very good point there. Looking at some more. One person mentions Anze Kopitar, who was picked by the LA Kings right after the Canucks picked Luc Bourdon. Anze Kopitar has 0.88 point per game and turns 38 in 3 weeks. Henrik Sedin had a 0.81 point per game and quit at 37, so the ages match up perfectly for that comparison. One person believes I think the Canucks would have won the Cup in 2011 with Kopitar, probably with Bourdon, but you're right. Not sure what he could have been. Looking at some more. Yeah, another person says Bork instead of Vave in 79 and Jagr instead of Nedved in 1990. The whole 91 draft, I'm sure it would have led to a cup in 1994. Another person says Jagr instead of Nedved, Keith Tkachuk instead of Antosky, Chris Simon instead of Slager. They mention Jagr, Bure, Prime Linden, Ronning, Tkachuk, Courtnall, Adams. What a group of forwards. Throw in a fourth line of McIntyre, Tim Hunter, and either Gino or Simon. One person says, in more recent history, I'd take Matthew Tkachuk over Olli Juolevi. Maybe he'd stick around instead of bolting for the U.S. if he had Huggy on the squad as well. It's hard to say how he would impact future drafts, though. One person says they would consider Charlie McAvoy instead of Juolevi. Young right-handed defenseman who can play like that would have been a great partner for Hughes. It's a very good point. One person says I would have picked Luc Robitaille over Blaine Crest in the 7th round, 136th overall of the 1984 draft. Robitaille might have been enough to win Vancouver the 7th game of the 1994 Stanley Cup Finals, where the Rangers outscored them 3-2. This person says, and sticking with recent history, as these mistakes is why we're stuck being a mushy middle team at best. In 2014, I'm taking Nylander and Pastrnak over Virtanen and McCann. In 2015, I'm taking Aho over Besser. 2016, I'm taking Tkachuk over Juolevi. In 2018, I'm taking McLeod over Wu. And a lot of these rest of these ones are ones that we already said. Talking about Virtanen, Nylander and Virtanen. So there's that. So I'll let you guys in the comment section down below, let me know what you guys think. Who would you pick if you could go back in time and change a draft pick in Canucks history? It can be way back when, or it can be more recent. I mean, if I had to choose, obviously, when it comes to Virtanen and Nylander, obviously I would choose Nylander like every day of the week, especially considering how Virtanen, panned out. I would love to have a guy like William Nylander. Obviously, when it comes to Jared McCann, I absolutely love him as a player. And do you think the Canucks kind of butchered that with, trading him away? Just imagine if McCann was still on the team, or if they had drafted Pastrnak over McCann. Just imagine that. Just let yourself think about that for a second. David Pastrnak playing on the Canucks and playing on that first line with Elias Pettersson. Can't get any better than that. So yeah, let me know in the comment section down below what you guys think. And as always, if you guys like this video, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to stay up to date on all your Vancouver Canucks content, be sure to smash that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you don't miss a single video. If you prefer missed one. You can find and interact with us on social media. You can find us on Facebook. Just search The Line Change. Find our Facebook page. You can find us on Instagram at The Line Change. You can find us on X at Line Change Van. You can find us on TikTok at the TLC Podcast. You can also find us on Blue Sky at The Line Change. Feel free to give us a follow on all of our social media platforms. Now, if you prefer an audio version of this podcast, you can find us on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. On Spotify, feel free to give us a follow as well as rate and review us. It is, of course, greatly appreciated. But that's going to do it for this video. As always, let's go Canucks, and I'll see you guys in the next video.